Welcome to The Truth Will Not Be Silenced, the show that allows people to be seen, to be heard, and to be human. I'm your host, Melissa Woodfork White. In today's episode, we will talk about the BIPOC experience with Emmanuel Blanchard Jr. Sharing our stories allows us to encourage, inspire, motivate, uplift, and help people. There will be a special surprise at the end of the show. Be sure to listen all the way through for the details. Our special guest today is Emmanuel Blanchard Jr. He is a native New Yorker and the son of West Indian immigrants. Their numerous sacrifices inspired his love of education. Emmanuel has over 20, I'm putting you up there, 20 years of work experience in public education. However, his professional experiences led him to realize that many of society's greatest inequities were rooted in educational inequities. As such, he has helped students, parents, teachers, school leaders, and others identify ways to create more transparent and equitable educational systems. Emmanuel holds a Bachelor's of Arts from Columbia University, a Master's of Science in Education from Long Island University, and a Master's of Divinity from New York Theological Seminary, and is currently pursuing his ed degree, doctorate, from Vanderbilt University. Emmanuel is going to share with us about the BIPOC experience. Hi, Emmanuel. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for having us and having me rather. And it's great to be on the program, and I'm excited for what we're going to have a chance to discuss. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. But before we jump into it, I just want to say Morehouse School of Religion.
I got you. I
International
got you.
Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia.
I see you. I see you. All right.
And so, with that being said, let's go ahead and get right into our first question.
Yes, ma'am.
Why did you become an educator, and what is BIPOC? So I want you to break it down, take the first part first, and then we'll jump into the second part of the question.
No problem. As you mentioned so eloquently in the introduction, I am the child of West Indian immigrants. My parents come from Haiti, and when you come from, I was born here in the States, so I had no choice in terms of where I was going to be born. That was a decision that was made for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I would ask my parents why here as opposed to being born in our ancestral home, their answer was is that the opportunity for us to have an education, a quality education, would have been nearly impossible. Haiti is one of these countries where there is no affordable public schooling. It's all private schooling.
Mm-hmm.
So the very reason why my parents decided to leave everything behind, parents, other familial relationships, their local neighborhoods, professions, the reason why they left it behind and came to this country, specifically came to New York, was so that my siblings and I, my older siblings and I, could have the opportunity of having access to quality education. So why did I become an educator? Well, it's really the fulfillment of a sacrifice that was made for me years before I was even born. And because of that, I was able to see, and because I'm the youngest of four children, I was able to see in real time the power of how education can unlock access for historically oppressed peoples. Which then brings me to the second part of the question. What is the BIPOC or the BIPOC experience? What does BIPOC mean? It means Black, Indigenous, people of color. Uh, the reality is having come from a society, having come from a history of people who were economically oppressed, what that looks like in a Black majority country versus what that looks like in the United States is two very different experiences. So in Haiti, it's less of an issue of racism, it's more of an issue of colorism.
Mm-hmm.
The experience that you have as an oppressed person here, whether you're Black, Indigenous, people of color, it's a very unique construct. And so, one of the things I noticed becoming an educator and often operating in predominantly white spaces
Mm-hmm.
is that My role, my voice, my experience, the requirements, the standards are entirely different than many of my white colleagues. So BIPOC is really shorthand for historically marginalized groups to craft and to shape and to insert and to center their experiences in spaces that would otherwise erase the nuances of their experiences.
Whew, you giving us a mouthful. I've experienced what you just described and explained to us, and this is the reason why it intrigues me, is
Mhm.
because the bi, say it again.
BIPOC.
Okay, I'm just gonna say BIPOC.
I got you. I got you.
It so intrigued me because of your own personal story and how choices were made before you were born
Hmm.
based off of your native country and how the education system is set up there where it would not been afforded to you. And then how your parents made the decision to come to the United States and specifically New York State, you know, New York. And so they made that decision beforehand because they understood what it is that you are educating us about. That
Yes.
is
Yes.
even though the term itself is new to me,
Hmm.
the experience itself has been happening for a very, very long time. And
Absolutely.
so I wanted you to share with us, after now you've had shared your story
Hmm.
and how you became an educator, and now you've explained to us the BIPOC, what it is. I
Hmm.
want you to explain to us, give us a specific example or a story of where this has happened to you. You have shown us how it happens
Hmm.
and why it is important, but tell us your experience with it. I want you
Uh,
to go in deep because you gave us
oh,
an. I want you to describe it for our audience, our listeners, and our viewers.
oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that, any educator of color, whether you're Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, you can have this experience, and there are nuances to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, the strength of the BIPOC experience is that it lumps us into a more universal experience.
Mm-hmm.
However, one of the issues is that not every single experience is exactly the same. Um,
Exactly.
being a Black male educator, um, I have, one of the things I talk about very explicitly with school districts is hiring practices. Um, your name has to look and sound a particular way to appease or to
Yes.
pacify or to even get entry into the door.
Yes.
If you want specific examples from my own personal experience, where I presently teach, I've been the only Black educator, by and large, there for the past 20 years. And I routinely, one of my jobs is to routinely remind people that being the only is problematic
Mm-hmm.
because the weight and the pressures and the expectations that the only has is significantly different from the weights and pressures than my white colleagues have. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, when there are racial instances, when there are episodes of racial aggressions or microaggressions, I'm often the person people come to specifically address and to try to remedy or to try to heal whatever issue exists. However, at the same time, and I constantly come back to
I gotta
institutions and
interrupt
remind,
you. I'm sorry,
yeah,
Emmanuel. So you're the DEI person too.
yeah, I'm the de facto DEI person, but here's what
I had to.
here's
I had to.
you're right. You're absolutely right. But here's when you ask the question of how specifically have
Mm-hmm.
I experienced the BIPOC experience, one of the most insidious things that institutions do is that they pretend as if they exist in this state of racelessness, except for when issues of race pop up.
Yes.
And I think that's an experience that many of us have had, particularly if you are a Black person in education, because that's been true of the history of education. Public education was founded in a segregated world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only since Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which I always have to remind my students
Mm-hmm.
that 1954 sounds like it's a long time ago.
But it's not.
It really is not because they have adults in the building who were born or alive in
Yeah.
1954. I have to remind my students that, 1954 sounds like it's a long time ago. It's only about 20 plus years before I was born.
Mm-hmm.
So when you contextualize it in that way, and the fact that desegregation never fully took root in, for example, suburban elite communities where there were economic privileges that afforded for people to say, we're not going to desegregate and we're going to create de facto segregation.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that there are guardrails that prevent entry for qualified people to enter into the most lucrative of aspect or lucrative positions within the fields, of course, you develop this sense of racelessness as a mask for de facto segregation. Um, so I've experienced it. I've experienced, microaggressions with parents.
Mm-hmm.
I've experienced microaggressions with colleagues. The hardest part though is when we're talking about children
Mm-hmm.
and having them to experience the first time where they're in the comfort of their schools and they're called the N word.
Yes.
The experiences of having to deal with parents who do not have as much political access or power versus their white counterparts. So I could run through a laundry list of experiences. I think the biggest one that I'm confronting right now, and this has become my North Star, this
Mm-hmm.
has become my mission,
Mm-hmm.
is really exposing the inequities that exist with regards to hiring.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll just finish with this one point, and this will make people feel uncomfortable, including some of my peers who may see this.
Mm-hmm.
But you read through my resume.
Yes.
One of the things that people do not think about, particularly with racelessness as a concept, is are the expectations and the standards the same for people of color versus their white peers? And it's been my experience having taught in New York City, having taught on Long Island, that that is not true. The standards are not the same. I have to lead with my academic pedigree. I have to lead with
Same.
my resume.
Same
And
here.
it's not the same as my peers. The
No.
expectations are not the same.
No. And you know what? And you are so right in everything that you said. And I appreciate you sharing one of your own experiences with us so that we can get that foundational, that understanding of being able to break down these racial barriers, especially in education. I just wanted to share before we get to the next question that
Mhm,
I've experienced what you've experienced. We moved to Arizona. Each school that I've taught in Arizona, I've had to fight. I know you didn't use that word, but I'm going to use that word because it has been a fight, and I've had to
mhm,
lead with my 30 plus years in
mhm,
education, in my career, in my profession, multiple degrees, multiple
mhm.
certifications, teaching overseas in 3 different countries. I've had to lead with that, and I still get questioned. I
Yeah,
still get
absolutely.
questioned. And in addition to that, this is the first time in the latter part, in the latter half of my career, that I've experienced what you just said, being the only one.
Oh yeah.
I got asked by another colleague that looks like me, am I the only one? And I was like, yeah. And when I say the only one, either the only one that looks like me or the only Black professional woman. So they
Yeah.
may have
Yeah.
a Black professional man, one, and then they
Oh
may
yeah.
have one Black professional woman. But majority of the time that I've taught here, I've been the only one. And so, and you're right, it is, they need to recognize that it is a different criteria for persons of color versus our counterparts who are the predominant in the area in which we are teaching.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas coming from the East Coast, I had a different experience. I started teaching in Washington, D.C.,
Oh,
and
okay.
I taught in Atlanta,
Mhm,
the metropolitan Atlanta, and two of the biggest districts. And I will say right now, teaching in Atlanta, in what's called the Mecca of the South,
mhm,
that that's the most diverse experience that I've had. I'm gonna be honest, when I taught in DC, there was a lot of us that looked like me
mhm,
in
mhm.
Washington, DC. But when I taught in Atlanta, there was a lot of us that looked like us, but half the staff was, Caucasian. They were, other races. So it wasn't just that predominant factor, even if
Yeah.
it was my race. Does that make sense?
No, it
So I
absolutely
was
makes sense.
I
Yeah.
was working with all types. And even when I went overseas, I'm going to tell you right now, when I went overseas, even though I was not the predominant, I've taught in the Middle East, in France, and in England. I was
Hmm.
not the predominant, but I did. There were other groups that looked like me. So I wasn't the
Hmm.
only one.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? So that leads
Yeah.
me into my next question because I know we're treading all the way over into it.
Let's do it.
What are some of the things schools and school districts do that make the BIPOC educator experience worse? And what could schools and school districts do to improve the BIPOC educator experience?
It's a great question. One of the things that that's become really my North Star, as I mentioned earlier, is really exposing hiring practices. A lot of school districts are not very transparent in terms of what are the requirements for being hired into school communities. And the reason, before I explain why this is such a big deal for me, let me just talk about the impact that it has on the school population.
Okay.
Um, there's a difference between the demographics of your faculty versus the demographics of your students, you know, and that is political. That is very political. That is very in, you know, you, school power brokers. So what I mean is our board of ed,
Mm-hmm.
superintendents, assistant
Yes.
superintendents, attendants of superintendents of business, your principals. If they're very mindful of kids being the priority, you have to create a roster of resources, i.e., your faculty,
Mm-hmm.
that can work to the benefit of all of your students.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very prevalent in a number of school districts, not all, to not bear in mind or to not consider who the students are, but rather the relationships that power brokers already have with potential candidates.
Mm.
What I mean by that is, are you hiring based upon skill or are you hiring based upon relationship?
Nepotism runs
There you
deep.
go. And that's the insidious thing that schools often do, that they lock
Mhm.
out candidates of color. Because as I mentioned before, I live in New York City. However, people would be frightened to know how segregated New York City is. They'd
Yes.
be frightened to know how segregated the suburbs surrounding New York City, how segregated they are. And as a result, you then see not only de facto segregation in neighborhoods, you see de facto segregation in the school system within these neighborhoods. And so often you don't see the demographics of students represented within the actual school buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And then there tends to be this break between the culture within the school and the culture of the community. Um, so I am very much so passionate about what are the practices, what are the clear practices that exist within school districts with respect to hiring. And I'll give you one more example. Another thing that schools do that really, really make the lives of BIPOC educators very difficult is when you have this racelessness, idea, this conception that race doesn't exist, or what's happening now that everything is equal, race doesn't matter, is that it erases the reality. Let's take the educators out of the equation for a second.
Okay.
It erases the reality or the lived experiences of children of color.
Mm.
And what that then suggests is that those who are empowered within school districts are not necessarily vested in the real lived experiences of BIPOC children.
Mm-hmm.
To pretend as if, for example, right now, like
Mm-hmm.
right as we're speaking,
Yes.
that the experiences of Hispanic, Latino, Latinx children are exactly the same right now as their other counterparts is disingenuous. It's a lie. It's not true. And so this is where we have to ask ourselves, is this conception of racelessness real, or is it an effort to mask our unwillingness to confront the uneasy truths about the historical
Mm.
implications of race in this country.
Yes. Oof. I had to hold myself while you were talking. I literally, I know you saw my facial expressions.
I
I
did. I
literally
did.
had to hold myself because the United States Department of Education has done multiple evidence-based research.
Hmm.
Harvard University has
Hmm.
done multiple evidence-based research. I can go on and on about having a diverse administration that reflects your diverse student population and the impact and the implications that that makes on students
Yeah.
of color.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there. You can Google it. The
Yeah.
research is there. It's there. But no one's having these conversations, Emmanuel. No one's
Yeah.
addressing it. They keep on turning a blind eye to it. And then you touched on it. I said what it was. As you can see, I'm just going to say it.
You gonna keep
It's
it real. Just keep it
nepotism.
real. It
Yeah,
is. It is
it's
absolutely nepotism.
nepotism. We get looked over, passed over for positions in which we are more than qualified to do
Mhm.
because of our race,
Yeah.
because of nepotism. You want to hire your friends of friends of friends who look
Mhm.
like you, who doesn't have the experience that we have, and then you're negatively impacting our student bodies of color. And so with that
Absolutely.
being and so with that being said, drawing on my own experiences, especially teaching here in Arizona,
Hmm.
is that all the schools that I've taught at, the administrators are predominantly Caucasian white. Okay.
Hmm.
In addition to that, the populations of the schools in which I have taught at are predominantly Black and brown.
Hmm.
I've had to experience for the first time in my life at 45 plus years of blessed age on God's earth, a child telling me when I first came to teach here that I'm the first person, Black teacher that they've ever had.
Yeah.
I nearly
Yeah.
hit the floor, Emmanuel, because I was
Yeah.
like, that's unheard of. I'm from Chicago. You know, I was taught on the East Coast.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
taught in 3 different countries, and I was
Yeah.
never their first Black teacher. But
Mm.
I come to Arizona, and every school that I've taught at, I'm their first Black core subject teacher. And when I say core subject teacher, I'm not
Yep.
talking about if you have a paraprofessional or a
Yes.
teacher's assistant, someone
Yes.
that assists with the student. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the professional, the core
Hmm.
subject that's responsible for these students mastering the Common Core curriculum standards and mastering test taking so that they can get scholarships and go to school and prepare for the SATs, ACTs. This is what I'm talking about. I'll give you a prime example and then we'll move on to the third question because you, boy, man, yeah, okay. So, one of my experiences that I've experienced with BIPOC
Hmm.
is that when I have those disagreements that you touched on, either I'm the person that they come to because I'm the
Hmm.
Black professional
Hmm.
teacher, or I'm the one that it's the problem.
Hmm.
And I know you didn't touch on this, but a part you said that BIPOC is multifaceted. And so
Yes.
I have to say this is that that's where we deal with the code switching.
Yes. Absolutely.
That's where we
Absolutely.
deal with the code. I've done that my entire life, Emmanuel.
Same.
And now that I
Same.
am almost 50, I'm like, I'm done with that. I'm done with those battles. I'm done. I
Yeah.
don't have to prove
Yeah.
myself I didn't have to prove myself to you then, and I definitely don't have to prove myself to you now. If you can
Yeah.
see and value the work in which I do without separating me or holding me to higher
Mhm.
expectations because of the color of my skin, my educational critiques, and blah, 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 then we can move forward. But when you
Mm.
always have to bring up something where I have to defend that,
Mm.
we're taking 10, 20 steps back.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that leads me into I want to touch on a little bit more about that last question.
Hmm.
And you said to us how districts, schools and school districts make the BIPOC educator experience worse, it's in the hiring practices when you're hiring
Hmm.
friends instead of hiring for expertise, experience, and so forth. And you also told us also that what could school districts and schools do to improve that educator experience? You talked about the hiring process and how to remove the what's the term that you I'm just gonna say to have those hard conversations about
Yeah.
racism and to have
Yeah.
those hard conversations about what do you call it? What's the word? Hey, you know the other word that they like to use when they're talking about race? The different
Uh,
views. It'll come to me later. But just
uncomfortable conversations. Is
yeah,
that the term that you're looking for?
no, because I know that one. It's
Yeah.
what's it called? It's a thing where you have the different biases. That's
Yes.
the
Yes.
word I was
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
for.
Yeah.
They don't want to have those hard conversations about race when
Hmm.
race is prevalent. It's there, it's not going anywhere. And then they don't want to have those hard conversations about those biases,
Yeah.
known and unknown biases. And when
Yeah.
they happen, they don't want to have those conversations. How can school and school districts improve that and have those conversations?
You have to have, um, I recently had this conversation with a colleague of mine who is a woman of color who's in a position of authority. And one of the questions you have to ask is what is really the mission of that particular institution? I wholeheartedly believe, and this is where my research is going in my doctoral program, um, schools represent so many different things for so many different people. Um, for me, as a person who's the child of immigrants, I love school because it's a haven of thought. It should be a haven of thought. It should be a haven of excellence. It should be a haven of critical learning and thinking skills. But for others, it's a career where it's just like, this is where I make my bread. This is where I make my money. This is where, I get to exercise political influence.
Mm-hmm.
And so schools have to decide, what are we actually? When the school decides, when the power brokers decide, I am doing this for the best interest of kids, the structures will fall into place.
Agreed.
Right now, what we have, and I'm speaking about a lot of different schools, whether it's New York City schools, whether it's local schools, whether it's schools in Arizona, we have individuals who say that they're operating in the best interest of kids, but they're actually operating in the best interest of self.
Mm-hmm.
When you actually operate in the best, more moralistic interest, this higher goal, this higher self, this higher aim, then you can have honest conversation. The inability to have the honest conversation is the unwillingness to be introspective or the unwillingness to be self-reflective. And so we construct these systems, we construct these patterns that protect our insecurity. So, for example, for schools that don't like to discuss race, it's because they have a race issue.
Ooh, you said it. You said it. I was gonna say it, but you said it. That is so true. That is so true. And then they want to say that they
All right,
don't. Anytime that they say that
exactly.
they don't, Emmanuel, they
They
do.
do. They
They
do.
do.
They do. It really, and it's evident. It's evident. So, like for
Hmm.
example, in my experience as an educator, when you can refer to me as the black teacher, it means that there's an actual race issue because
Hmm.
no one else is referred to as the
White
the
teacher,
the white
the
teacher, like
Caucasian teacher. You're
because that's
right.
the default. That's the
You're right.
default, which means that inherently there's a race issue. You've just created language and structure to pretend as if there isn't a race issue. You get what I'm saying? And one of
Yes.
the things also too that you pointed to is the core teacher, like the person who's teaching your
Hmm.
math, your science, your
Yes.
literature. I went K through 12 and I had one black teacher. Actually, I'm sorry. I went through high school and I had one black teacher and he was the music teacher.
Mm. You knew what I was talking about. You
I
knew
know
what I
exactly what
was
you're
talking
talking about.
about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I was fortunate in elementary school to have a few black teachers, but that's because I lived in a particular neighborhood at the time
Hmm.
where it was like, well, you're going to have a black teacher because it's a poorer neighborhood.
Mm.
But when my family
Those
moved to a
demographics.
more exact, the demographics, de
Hmm.
facto segregation,
Yes. You schooled us on that.
My experience moving from a black neighborhood into a predominantly white neighborhood where we were the one black family on the block,
Mm,
and then I go into this new school, I'm like, well, part of the current sociopolitical discord that we're having right now, or conversations that we're having,
mhm.
it's in part because we have a lot of people who don't interact with people of color.
Yes.
And if they do, it's a passing glance. And so, this is a very long answer to simply say, what can schools do to open up and to improve with regards to these issues? Is that, well, first of all, you have to empower, your staff who are BIPOC to
Hmm.
be able to be honest and to be honestly themselves.
Yes. Not
Secondly,
code switching to make you feel comfortable in your skin.
exactly,
And that makes us feel uncomfortable in our skin.
and tired,
Yes.
and tired. I think the second thing is that you have to be open to reflection. And I think a lot of institutions, a lot of K-12 education systems are not good at reflection,
Mm-hmm.
especially
Agreed.
in these political times.
Agreed.
In these times, there are a lot of different things that are going on where it's hard for institutions to be self-reflective. But when you aren't a self-reflective institution, you will create structures that mask your problems and mask your structural insecurities.
Which is the foundation of the educational system in the United
Yeah,
States of America. So,
yeah.
Emmanuel, I'm going to have to stop us there. This conversation has been rich and deep. I need for you to tell our audience, those that are listening and those that are watching, how they can get in contact with you to learn about more, to get educated about more, um, to empower themselves. Tell us.
Uh, so I'm on all socials, EJ underscore that little line, Blanchard, which is BLAN as in Nancy, CHARD. Primarily, I'm a Instagram person, and I'm really like, if you want to hear me write these thoughts out, I'm really growing on threads. So, this is where you get like bullet point, like ideas. In the very near future, I'm actually working on a couple of books. So that should, as soon as I get more information, just follow me on Instagram, EJ underscore Blanchard, threads, EJ underscore Blanchard, also on Facebook. Not so much X anymore,
I understand.
not so much.
Well, thank you.
But yeah, but thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was awesome and very educational and very enriching for all people. And so, with that being said, next week we'll continue to discuss and share about real life experiences, both personal and professional, stories that need to be shared, seen, and heard that makes us human. The truth will not be silenced, to be seen, to be heard, to be human. The surprise. If you like to leave a positive comment about our show, you'll get a shout out. This includes businesses, product services, organizations, and events. Following the link in the show notes lets Buzzsprout know that we sent you and help support our show. Buzzsprout is the best way to launch a professional podcast. Want to ask a question, be a guest, or subscribe to our podcast, The Truth Will Not Be Silenced? Click on the show link. Thank you so much for joining us.